Guys, will you please help me welcome with all of your joy that's in you, our teacher for this morning, Dr. Jim Wilder. Come on up.
All right.
You got it.
Okay, we can. Big title right there, neurotheologian. People think I came up with it, but I didn't. I found it on the internet. But I was actually taught neurotheology by one of the people who invented the electroencephalogram machine that examines brain waves. And the interesting thing was we all think about it as sort of hardware and software. So hardware is, this is the way God wired our machine. And software is, how's it supposed to be run? And so the rules in the Bible should make a brain run the way it's supposed to work if these were both created by the same person. So every time we look at it, we go like, wow, it runs better this way. So the two things the brain is built to run on is joy and peace. Every brain wants joy and peace. You look in the Bible, every time God promises blessing, he says, I'll bless you with joy and peace. Wherever you see the Holy Spirit shows up, it's almost those created for the brain to run right, you know. When it runs wrong, it runs on fear. And whenever you find demonic forces in your life, what's going on? Fear, right? Yeah, that's what they run on. It's like, this is the wrong way. God never guides his people through fear. He guides his enemies through fear. And what happens if you're fearful is you're afraid something bad is going to happen to you. There's something too big in the world, right? God says, don't even worry about the people who kill your body. If you're just worried about what the biggest, scariest thing in the universe is, it's me. Because I can throw body, soul, everything, you know. So you're going to be afraid of anything, just forget all those people and everything else you're running away from and look at me. And when you look at me, you discover that I love you. So forget all the things you've been afraid of, and let's look at the biggest thing in the universe. And he says about you, I happen to like you. I happen to like you a lot. I happen to like what I'm actually building in you, but somebody else doesn't like you. And they intend to make you not like yourself and not let whatever I'm growing in you grow. So that's kind of where we are in the middle of it, right? And when the brain runs on fear, it does all sorts of things that we call mental illness. And when it runs on joy, that's what actually makes it physically grow. It's stimulated to grow. And the joy center in your brain can grow all across your lifespan. It's the only part of the brain that retains fetal biochemistry for the lifetime. And when a bunch of secular neurologists heard that, they stood up and gave a round of applause to, I guess, evolution, because that's all they had. But it kept them from deepest, darkest despair, because if that's what you really need in order to develop a self, how are we going to do that if the brain won't grow after a certain point? And a lot of parts of the brain don't. And so there's important parts of development and all that sort of thing. But I didn't come to talk to you exactly about that. I was invited actually to give a sermon here today. And so, you know, is talking about the brain a sermon? Well, I'm not sure. In fact, maybe you've never asked the question, what is a sermon? So we're going to talk about that today. You know, what is a sermon? What is it intended for? And how's it supposed to work? Because the Bible says almost nothing about sermons. They were created somewhat along the line in different ways. And so, you know, they serve a purpose. I'm not anti-sermon or anything like that, but that's part of why I'm sitting down, because, you know, normally you expect a sermon, someone will stand up and do have the sermon. It's a proper format. And then you've got to have a sermon voice, you know. I never tried to do that, but, you know, I can hear it when someone knows good at it, you know. And, all right. So, but basically, if you're going to remember what I'm talking about today, you only have to remember really two stories, and everything else is details. And the first story I want you to know is had gone backpacking in the high Sierras, which that's always such a miraculous, wonderful experience to do and be out there walking around nature. And I'd gotten up to the tree line, and I was sitting there looking at these hundreds of year-old trees that grow up there, and just marveling at them. And I'd been there a couple of hours kind of connecting with God and looking at these trees. When I heard God's voice, well, I didn't really hear it. I mean, if you'd had a recorder, you wouldn't have heard anything. And maybe it wasn't exactly a voice, but it was a thought anyway, very strong in my mind that didn't come from me. And it said, "You've never seen a tree." And I'm looking around going, wait a minute now. And I've been looking at nothing but trees or just admiring them for the last while. And so I kept looking at, what do you mean I've never seen a tree? And then the thought or the voice, whatever it was, continued. It said, "The trees you're looking at are nothing like the trees I created." And I realized as I looked at the trees that this one had a broken off branch there, and this one was twisted, and this one was frozen at the top, and that one had funny roots and stuff like that. And it occurred to me that he wasn't talking about trees. He was talking about how we've turned out, not being the way he designed us to be, because we look like the storm of '73 and the lightning strike of '86 and the beaver or whatever it was that chewed on our trunk, a few years later and all of that. And so something started to just sort of marvel in me. So the idea there seemed to me, took me out of the story of Jesus. He said, this man was born blind, and so Jesus healed him. And he started looking at people, and he said, "I see people, but they look like trees." And so Jesus gave him a second touch, and then he could see more clearly. And then people said, "Who's this guy that healed you?" And he said, "I've been blind all my life. You can't see who it is that healed me?" And it's because we can look at Jesus and not see who he is. But more difficult for us is to look at ourselves and see what Jesus sees, because we see the storm of '76 and what the beaver chewed on and all those sorts of things, and we think, who would want a tree like this? Except that when God looks at it, he sees the tree that you're going to be in 500 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. He's looking at that, and that's good. So I know it hurt when the beaver bit you, but we're going to work with that if you give it to me, and it'll still do my purposes. Everything about your life can be fulfilled. And so the thing I want maybe to remember is you've never seen a tree. And the brain actually is incapable of seeing who you are. That may seem odd to you, but the brain's identity center is made up entirely of mirror neurons. The only way I can see who I am is by the way you look at me. That's how the brain is designed. So the way we understand who we are is by how other people see us. It's not designed to know ourselves directly. We know ourselves through others. So when the world looks at us, they see the lightning strike of 1971 and the storm damage from the year after, and they go, well, that's you. When God looks at us, he sees something else, and it's maybe not even had a chance to grow yet. You ever have something about you that developed long after you thought it could happen? Yeah. For instance, I was terrible at spelling. I had to repeat first grade, and I was the family dummy. They wouldn't let me involved in breakfast conversations because I just couldn't keep up with the rest of the family. And my grades weren't all that good because I didn't spell all that well, and I was always off thinking about something else when they were trying to work on mathematics or something like that. So I would come back and say, no, Johnny had 7 apples and Mary had 9 oranges, and so then how many are there? And I'd go like, well, why don't you just share them? You know, this is no, the wrong answer. Yeah. So that, anyway, the result was I didn't think I was very good at school, and so all my classmates agreed, and most of my teachers. So I got to college, and this very secular, liberal professor asked us to write a creative paper, so I wrote something, and he looked at that and said, wow, this is very interesting, you should be a writer. And I said to him, I can't even spell. And he looked at me like, who cares? You've got some interesting ideas. He saw something in me that I'd never seen, and I would never have imagined. And I'm now up to 20 books. Yeah. And, you know, it's like, yeah. Right. But that's because someone saw in me something I would have never seen in myself, and I never would have tried to do it. And this is, again, what God does. He says, I know I planted something in you, and no one has ever seen it before and hadn't had a chance to grow. But where are we going to go to find a people who will look in us and see what God sees and say to you, you know what, I think you've got this planted in you. And because I see it and I encourage it and I know that God's in the spirit somehow or another, this is going to grow in you, and you will look at that and go, you must be out of your mind. If you had any idea who I was, you would know I was born blind and I can never see a thing. And when I do try to look, things don't look quite right yet. So, you know, God sometimes gives you a second touch, and in my case, many more than 2. But you see, this is the wonderful news of being there. So that's the one story. If you can remember, you've never seen a tree, and think to yourself, there is a tree in here someplace. Well, what it could look like, it's like Paul says, looking into this mirror darkly. Like we can faintly see what could be there, but it isn't there yet. And when I try to use it, it isn't fully developed, so it doesn't work right. And so I wonder, you know, is it ever going to be what it's supposed to be? You know, but if I was only in a place where they would encourage that and see it and call it out in me and say, we'll help that to grow. And we're going to help you heal from the thing, the beaver bite, you know, that wasn't meant to be there. God, you know, God can redeem it, but, right? Okay, now the second thing that I want you to remember is I was between 2 and 3 years of age when I had my stroke and I came to the U.S. for medical treatment. And it was the first time that I had ever seen snow. And I didn't know what this snow stuff was. It was very marvelous. I presume it looked really good. Don't remember exactly because, you know, our brain doesn't have a fully formed memory system yet at age 2 that you can retrieve. So, but I'm told from the family story that my dad was visiting my grandmother and he thought, well, I should clear the sidewalk. So he went out to clear the sidewalk and he's shoveling the snow off. And I followed out behind him and I found a little shovel and I was helping shovel the snow. And I was shoveling it, you know, the only place I could find snow was by the side of the sidewalk and I was moving it back on the sidewalk. And my dad turned around and he said, what are you doing, Jimmy? And he said, I'm helping you, Daddy. Now, my dad just loved that story. He loved to tell it everywhere. And, you know, here's where we get to what a sermon is. Sermons are how we're helping Daddy. Now, the funny thing is God's just as delighted as he could be, even if we're shoveling the snow in the wrong direction. But we're trying to be like Daddy. And so when you come here, and I'm learning to be somebody I've never been, and you're shoveling snow like you've never shoveled before because you've never seen this stuff, and you're putting it in all the wrong places, Daddy's delighted. He's saying, yeah, that's my boy. That's my girl. They're being like me, making a mess. We'll have to clean it up later, right? But no matter. This is how we become something that we've never been before. And we looked at something we've never seen before, and we It's this learning process in which our spirits are becoming like the one we're learning from. And when people do sermons, they're trying to help Daddy. And you got to give them a little mercy for that sort of thing, because we're really not quite so sure what God needs help with. Now, I want to help, right? But what exactly kind of help does he need? And over the history of the church, the answers have varied. So the first thing the early church discovered was that most of the people were Greek-speaking, and the early scriptures have been written in Hebrew, and so the purpose of preaching or giving a sermon was to explain to people how much better you could understand God if you understood him the way the Greeks do, instead of the way the Hebrews do. Except the Hebrews were preaching it the other way around, how much better you could understand God if you understand the way the Hebrews think. And so it was sort of like a cultural war. Like, if you could enter my culture, then you could understand God, because my culture seems to understand God better than your culture. And of course they're helping Daddy, because they're trying to help their culture to understand what God is like, with using the understandings and the concepts in their culture. But in the middle of that, you also sort of put some of the snow in the wrong place. And now, for most of the history of the church, there was no preaching. Most pastors were not allowed to preach by the bishop, and that's because until about World War II, most pastors in the world were illiterate, and they'd never read the Bible. And so the bishop would have you memorize a few things. So you could memorize, for instance, the service, and for most of the history it was in Latin. But no one understood Latin. Often the priests themselves didn't either, but, Ec dies quam fecit Dominus, quam fecit Dominus. And it's beautiful, perhaps, but what did it mean? And so, but they were, again, helping Daddy. Well, we're helping you, Daddy. Because we're trying to explain to you that there's something grand about the whole thing. And even though we don't get it, that's true, isn't it? We don't get it, and there's something grand about it all. And if we obey God, this would be helpful. But you actually got your theological preaching when you went to confession. Then you told him what you'd been doing, and the priest would tell you, the pastor, because that's what there was. There wasn't Protestants and Catholics. The priest would tell you what you had been doing wrong and how much penance you needed to do to kind of clean up that mess. Shovel the snow back where it belongs. And that's where you actually learned what was good and bad. And if you missed something, I haven't heard you confessing this, so have you been doing that? And you got a little extra, theological coaching on what was good and bad about you. But this is the next problem. What was a sermon supposed to do? And part of the thing was, well, do we know what's good? So a sermon then began to be, for certain people, we're going to teach you what's good and what isn't. And so there's a whole set of sermons that are just to teach you what's good and what isn't. But there's another part of the church that says, well, everybody knows what's good, they're just not doing it. And so a sermon was actually to tell you what a bum you are because you're not doing the thing you're supposed to be doing, and you're supposed to do. And so the more we could emphasize just how bad you are by not doing what you know you're supposed to do, maybe the more we could incentivize you to do what you're supposed to do. And we're helping you, Daddy. But the result from that, of course, is a lot of people just end up feeling bad and hopeless about themselves, right? Because you're always doing something you're not supposed to be doing. And we're not even quite sure what we're supposed to be doing. So, again, this is the way it worked. And so then along came another set of theologies that said, well, the real reason for preaching is to make it easier for you to take the steps. And this is sort of the revival movement that came along. And in the revival movement, what we did was preachers like Finney and the rest would say, okay, we're going to break it down for you. So what we really want you to do is to make a decision or a commitment to follow Jesus. But nobody will do it if we do it that way. So would you all please close your eyes? And now, as you close your eyes, can we have some nice music here? Okay, I'll play music, softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you and for me. Now, can I see your hand? And you raise your hand. Okay, now, all of those who raised their hands, would you please stand? And now they're standing. So now, okay, now everybody open your eyes and look to the person next to you who's standing, and won't you guide them to walk down to the front, where then we'll take you to the next step. And so preaching was to break things down into little manageable steps so we could get people to make the right kind of decision. Now, making the right kind of decision, Calvin said in order to get the right kind of decision, you have to have all the right kind of truth. And that's when sermons really got into their own, because now I have to explain to you everything that you need to know in order to make the right decision. But that wasn't working so good, because the people understood it, but they still weren't doing it. So sermons had to shift a little bit over that. And the thing that they decided would be very helpful is we could get people to worry. And so churches put in a worrier bench in which you could worry about whether you were saved or not. And if you could worry long enough until you got some kind of inner conviction or peace, and if you went too fast, this wasn't good. So we wanted you to worry at least several months, if not several years. And then we would test you and see if you got the answers right. But most people couldn't do that, so they had a halfway covenant. So you can be halfway in the church and halfway saved. We don't know what to do with you exactly, but this is not the Pilgrims in the early church history and stuff like that here in the United States. But then along came the Methodists, and I've actually been in most of these traditions, so I'm borrowing from my own experience here, and they said, okay, well, let's hurry it up, because all we got to do is make this decision. So the faster we can get you there, the better it'll be for all of us. And so the purpose of a sermon then was to make you feel super bad and worried at the same time, that if you were to go home and you hadn't made a decision, you might go to hell. But here's the other problem. Then you have people like Jonathan Edwards, who said, if you made a decision to follow Christ because you didn't want to go to hell, you certainly aren't a Christian. Because a Christian would only be wanting to follow God because they loved God and they didn't care about themselves at all. So if you care about yourself, it's sort of catch-22, right? So you see, we're helping you, Daddy. We're trying to get people to solve your problem, which is how do you get people to become holy people. And now here's what I think may have gone wrong in that process. We've been focusing on how to get people holy. And the Keswick movement, which was one of the biggest ones in America, decided that the people that followed Jesus, made a decision to follow Jesus to be saved, you might say, they didn't get holy. They just were saved, and now they're fine, but they kept on living just the way they were before. And so they decided, what we have to do is get people over their pride. And so if you could just confess that there's nothing good about you and get over your pride, then you could let God come in and live in your life. Because that's another one of the problems. When Adam fell, according to Augustine, he lost the part of his self that knew how to be holy and love God. And so all that was left was the human part of himself, the brain and all that sort of stuff, that was hopelessly natural and wicked. And so no regulation, no chance to get back to being holy again. So if you got saved, you should get this module back that made you not care about yourself in the slightest, and all you cared about was God and spiritual things. And so if you didn't get that back, you couldn't have been saved, because this is what God's problem is trying to solve. How do we get a altogether useless, you might say, human being to be a very spiritual human being like Adam was. And so what happened? You see, these processes of the sermons, all we're helping you, Daddy, are trying to figure out what a tree looks like. And how do you get a tree to look like a tree after it's been hit by lightning? And what do you have to put it through in order to get there? And everybody's trying to be helpful with God, but maybe the problem isn't so much that we need to learn how to be holy. Maybe it's the second part of it. You're a holy people. Maybe we have to learn how to be people. And if we could learn how to be people, God could help teach us how to be holy. And so one of the things I wanted to explain to you is it is impossible with the human brain to know the right thing to do. So after all of that theology, we're going to teach you the right thing to do, we're teaching you you're doing the wrong thing, your brain simply can't figure it out. You've got, I'll use scientific notations, and scientific notations, how many zeros you have to put behind the number to make it the right number. So you've got the number of brain cells you have in your head is 10 with 13 zeros behind it. All right? Now, in order to figure out the right thing to do, you have to, Jesus says, you have to fulfill the whole law. There's, the large and the small things. You should do the large things without forgetting the small things. How many laws are there in the Old Testament? 613, yes, right. So how many, if you're going to combine those in all the different ways it could be compared, it would be 2 to the 613th power, which is a big number, but we'll convert it to mathematical, and it would be 3.4 times 10 to the 184th power. That's 184 zeros behind the 3.4. It's a rather large number, doesn't make any sense to you, and because it's just bigger than our brain can handle. But that's how many considerations you would have to make every time you wanted to figure out the right thing to do. Now, to put that in perspective, suppose I took one drop of water and I put that in the ocean, and you had to find that one drop of water out of all of the water in the ocean. Your chances of doing that would be what? Pretty bad, yeah. But that would only be 10 to the 16th power. There's 10 to the 16 zeros, number of drops of water in the ocean. So you don't be looking, we have to get 184 zeros behind this. We've only got 16. It's a very small number yet. So we took every atom in that. How many atoms are in a drop of water? Anyone happen to know? No, because you didn't look it up. I Google like I did. So there are 500,000 times more atoms in a drop of water than there are drops of water in the ocean. So that would be 10 with 21 zeros behind it, number of atoms in each drop of water. So we took every drop of water and we counted all of the atoms. We would still be way too small. In fact, if we took every atom in the entire universe, we would only have 10 with 80 zeros behind it, and we have to get to 184 yet. So we took every atom in our universe, and we make another universe the size of our universe for every atom that we have. We're still way too short to find that one atom you have to find in order to get the right answer. We would have to do that again as many times as there are stars in the heavens. Keep making another universe out of every atom. Now we'd be getting close. We only have to do that again 3.4 times in order to get down to the one atom we have to find to figure out what the right thing to do. And remember, you've only got 10 to the 13th power nerve cells. If every nerve cell calculated a universe of options of as many times as there was, every time it fired, it would take you 200 and some years to go through all those options. And you'd have to remember what they all were in order to figure out the right one to do. So God clearly didn't intend for us to figure it out that way. So all this preaching to teach you the right thing to do is chasing futility. What did Jesus do? He only did what he saw his Father doing. He never figured out the right thing to do. He just said, if Dad's doing it, I'll be doing it. Now that you can actually do if you can see what God is doing. And so we would need to be in a fellowship of people who say, do you see what God's doing? I can't see it today. I'm really upset. Can you do it today? I'm not feeling well. Can you do it today? I don't know why. I just can't figure out whether what I'm thinking is making sense or not. We'd have to be together and figuring out what God is doing. And then we could say, well, let's do what he's doing. What is he? What word does he give us today? What picture does he give us today? What message does he give us today? What prophecy does he give us today? What do we hear him thinking today? Are we all hearing the same thing? Because if two or three of you are hearing the same thing, you have some pretty good confidence. Do you hear two or three of you gathered together and you agree about anything? Well, there's this tradition that says, well, if three of us can agree that God should give me a Mercedes, then he's got to give me a Mercedes. No. Two or three of you are listening and you're hearing the same thing from God. Now you're starting to get a little confidence. This person heard this, that person heard that. You're hearing all the same thing? Maybe we're hearing clearly what God is doing here. This is life through faith. This is what God is saying. And that's more true than what our brain is seeing, because it's only seeing the past. And so the most important part, I think, then, of preaching or faith or church is to help us to see the tree that we've never seen, to see the tree in you that God is growing, and for you to see the tree in me that God is growing, because I can't see it for myself. I can see it once it started growing, but I can't see it beforehand. You see? Wouldn't this be a wonderful place to go to church? Now I made some notes here, which I can consult at this point. And so if God was going to make you a holy people would mean that you are actually the kind of tree that God meant you to be, and you're giving the kind of fruit that God meant you to have. And the people around you would be able to see that, encourage it, and have that happen. And so we would learn through our sermons how to see each other the way that God sees us, and how to see ourselves the way that God sees us, and to help that to grow. We would know that what God was going in us was good, but not necessarily because it had the approval of the world, or even because we were all that happy to be growing in this way or that way, because often, well, I'll just give you one other example. I was 19. Yeah, I was 19. I'm sitting in my college room reading Tolkien, just enjoying myself, when this very loud voice in my head says to me, I want you to be a preacher. And my immediate reaction is, oh no, anything but that. Because I'd seen preachers all my life, and I thought this is the most miserable way to go. I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to, do medicine, something really helpful. Then there's this terrible silence. And the next thought through my head was, I just said no to God. That's never a good idea. And so as the tension is building, right, because he's now not saying anything at all, he's smarter than I am, and if God wants me to be a preacher, he must know something about being a preacher that I don't know. So I said, okay, if you want me to be a preacher, I don't know why, but you know something I don't know, so I'll say yes. And the voice said, that's all I needed to know. Hallelujah, I don't have to be a preacher. It was just a test. It was like, Abraham and his son, go sacrifice your son. They're like, okay, no, we got a sheep here for you, a ram, you don't have to do it. And I was just delighted as could be. And then I had a mentor. He said, I'd like you to go to seminary. And so I went, okay, I'll go to seminary, but they'll study psychology when I get there, and that sort of thing. That was good. They, by the way, tried to run me out of seminary because I was hearing God's voice talk in my head, and that must be a crazy person if you hear God talk in your head. So they were going to run me out of seminary. But, so it wasn't going well. But So then I went to work at Shepherd's House, which is the organization I'm still with. They've changed their name to Life Model Works. And the board came to me and said, we'd like all of our counselors to become ministers. Have you ever thought of being a pastor, preacher like that? That fit with you? And I could feel God just grinning, like, yeah. I said, yeah, I've heard that before. So I went and got ordained. It was really quite amusing because the church that ordained me said, we don't actually have a rule in our book that says you have to be a member to ordain us. I think it'd be a hoot to ordain you. So they ordained me even though I wasn't a member of their church. Just because they're sort of contrary about it. It's nice again to see God sort of smiling, like, I'm not playing by the rules here, but I'm growing a tree. I'm growing a tree that, you can't even see yet, right? So then Dallas Willard came to visit us one day, and he was teaching us about Jesus. And he said, the thing about Jesus, he came doing three things. He came teaching, casting out demons, and preaching. And, of course, which word caught my attention out of that. I said, yeah, okay, well, we're always healing here, and we're casting out demons almost every day. But the preaching thing, that's the one thing I don't do. And they turned around and looked at me as though he knew what I was thinking, but I think somebody else was behind the look, right? He said, do you know what preaching is? And that stumped me. I didn't know what preaching was. I mean, I know what preachers were, but what is actually preaching? He says, it's announcing good news. He said, do you like announcing good news? Well, we just discovered about the brain being designed for joy, and I couldn't stop telling everybody about it. Joy in the brain, joy. I said, have I got good news? I want to tell everybody about it. And it's like God had me so busted right there. It's like, I knew it. You were going to be announcing good news. You had no idea how this was going to work out, right? He grew a tree. I didn't know the tree was growing there, And then he just said, why have I given you this job? He said, because you said yes. And this is what we want to do. We want to say yes to God. We want to be able to look at each other and go, I don't know what God's growing in you, but it's going to be delightful, and I'd love to be the first one to find it. Yeah? And if so, I want to be the biggest encourager of that every time I'm around. Remember, my wife left me at one point because she was mad at me, and I was being maybe a little thick-headed, and I thought to myself, this is my worst fear come true. Because there was a fight over ministry, actually. I thought we should minister that way. She thought, and we're trying to do the right thing, figure it out, but figuring out the right thing when it's, astronomically impossible to do it ends up being a good way to hurt a lot of people. Because you have to say, what is God doing? And it was like, well, do you want to be her encourager or not? And I said, well, yeah. I said, no one ever leaves their encouragers. So do I want to encourage what God is growing in you? Do I want to be the biggest encourager of what God is growing in my wife's life of anybody on the planet? Do I want to be the first one to see that? I mean, it's easy to see where the beaver took its bite, and where the lightning struck it. But do I want to see what God is growing? And when we see each other that way, suddenly the things that used to annoy us are like, yeah, but that's when you don't know who you really are. When you know who you are, now you are, what did God say about people? Yes. Yeah, in the Old and New Testament says, what are human beings that you even think about them? For you have made them a little lower than Elohim and crowned them with glory and honor. Now that passage is sort of interesting. If I was to see who you are, it's a being of glory and honor. And God pays attention to that, and you're just slightly below the Elohim, the gods, the spirits. God himself is the Elohim. Why did he put us there? Why did he create that? That's the tree that I have really never seen. But it's always there, and it's always growing. And if so, we're restoring each other to the glory and honor by being able to see and witness that and encourage it, that God is wanting to grow all forever, because it'll be an eternal tree. And wouldn't you like to be part of that process? Wouldn't you like to receive that process? Wouldn't you sort of doubt that it's even possible that that could be who you are? Because we're too used to the lightning strike and think that must be what a tree looks like. Because every tree in our family forest has looked like that, or maybe even worse, right? So this is what we come here for. And I hope I've helped you a little bit, Father. I may have shoveled a lot of snow where it didn't go. But I think he's pretty delighted in what he has in mind for each one of us. And we have no idea what that looks like. And if we could just lean into that together and say, well, teach us about it. The way I'd like you to do that, just really briefly right now, is to think about a moment. We approach God's presence with thanksgiving in our hearts. So I want to think of a moment, and I'll ask the Holy Spirit to help you with this, when God was close to you, you just knew he was there. And thank him for that moment. Michael back there would call that a golden memory. Yeah. Because in everyone's life, there's a moment we knew God was there. He was with us. He was actually paying attention to us. So I want you to notice what it felt like when he was there with you. And then sense the look that was on God's face. If you're like me, you don't see God's face. You sort of sense what he's doing. Sort of sense him smiling. I've been feeling that about today for about a week, like God's thinking about today, and he's just got this smile, really warm smile on his face, like, oh, this is going to be good. And now, because he lives in you, tell God he can share your face with you. Let him put the look that's on his face on your face. I noticed that most of you closed your eyes to do that. I didn't ask you to close your eyes, but you did. That's fine. But now I want you to open your eyes and keep God's look on your face and look at the person next to you on either side and let God look through your face and eyes and show him how he looks at them. That's God looking at your tree. And you become his face. And it's only when we see it in another face that we know that that's how we look. Because that's how our brain was meant to be. And now you are all helping Daddy. We're going to be his face in the world. So I'd like you to just take about 10 minutes and share with each other. Now, this is going to be tricky because when you share with each other, we tend to forget to share our face with God. People are very, very distracting to your brain. And it takes a lot of practice to stay connected with God and let him share our face while we're talking to another person. So if you forget and put the snow in the wrong place, let's not worry about it. But, say, I'll just need more practice because my brain is untrained in the business of sharing my face with God, right? So, but then what I do, just so you know, when people distract me, I look down and I remember that golden memory, that time when God was with me. I go, okay, now I've got him again. All right, good. Now look up at people. And I've been doing this for years. No one has yet caught me looking down, connecting with God, and looking back up again. They just think that's what you do. You look down, and you go, so while he's still listening, I could tell he was paying attention. And I just make this part of my daily practice. Whenever I lose God, I just look down. There he is again. Okay, now I'm back with you. And then you do something annoying, and I have to connect. I mean, this is how it is, right? Yeah, it's really, trying to stay connected and with each other. People are the most distracting thing for the human brain possible, right? So we're doing something really tough here. But go ahead, look down, connect with God, let him share your face, then look up and tell each other, what was it that got your attention today?